would be like funeral associations and loan associations and borrowing associations. Like the government is now active in that space as well, but that opens up religious associations, and I don't want to go into that broader sphere because I think this amendment is relevant to control over power and control over resources. Now going into, how am I doing on time, by the way?
2 more minutes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now going specifically into the legislation, what you see is you see both components. If you look at, I think there's reporting that the political advocacy bits have been changed now, but at the end of the day, if you think whether it's changed or not, the impetus for that is the political space where they are previous elections. It looked like, and we should be honest with ourselves, by the way, it looked like in the previous elections, the civil society space, the formal NGO space was very, how do I put this delicately? The civil society space was important for the government in its attempt to bring legitimacy to the process. And I have faulted civil society organizations for that because they did, I don't know if we can say the process was legitimate. I can't say it was successful in gaining legitimacy, but to the extent that it was an authoritarian election that was almost 100% won by one party, it's gained a lot of legitimacy, in part thanks to the participation and support of civil society organizations. Civil society organizations gave legitimacy to the election, but they didn't get anything else in return in terms of making the process more democratic. Now it looks like the government has decided that it's going to go in a different direction. It's going to push out civil society organizations, political advocacy, and things like that. Even if that changes, in effect, in reality, I think the same outcome is going to be achieved by the government in terms of it's not going to allow civil society organizations to contest, to expose, electoral issues and things like that. Now, going specifically to the legislation, there are a couple of typical issues that you see with it. There is, for example, even if we assumed Ethiopia as a country has a legitimate interest in making sure that foreign funding doesn't influence politics. I say assume legitimate interest because for a government whose economic policy is driven by the World Bank, I don't think they have a legitimate claim in terms of saying, oh, we're trying to free politics from foreign influence. But even if we assume that, the challenges that we had with it, with the wording, is that there was legal certainty was completely lacking. If you read the words, you can't reasonably foresee what is included in the prohibitions and what isn't. If you look at, for example, refusal to register based on national interest, it's like, what does that mean? It's not reasonably foreseeable to understand. Taking those words, you can't understand whether X, Y, Z are included or not. But B, it also allows for arbitrary interference. So the government will have the leverage to choose who it thinks that is going against the national interest, national security, and so on. And then the other big issue is the rights to appeal to the judiciary is restricted, which means that it's not just a question of the government making it a bit more difficult and creating hoops for organizations that it doesn't want registered, but it actually has the final say. So everything in terms of the administrative issues that I'll talk about are relevant to this, and especially given that you can't appeal them. However, I want to also emphasize, and this is important for our conversation in terms of the civil society, pro-democracy civil society space, we have to realize, A, that this is not just about us, and B, that the structural impact is also going to be about control over resources and control over corruption. So, by the way, we have to, and Masarat was alluding to this earlier as well, the civic society space is almost non-existent in Ethiopia right now. So the impact of this legislation is reaffirming and doubling down on those, on what exists today. But in actual fact, there are only a few civil society organizations that are doing human rights work and democracy work that are left. And they're also, as Masarat alluded to, already self-censoring. So it's not as if they can have. No, they have a big impact. They can, but they don't have a big impact. But the important thing to note is, as far as civil society, formal registered civil society organizations are concerned, the changes to the board, cumbersome reporting and auditing requirements, really strong and almost absolute disciplinary and auditing powers. The requirement now, the project agreements thing is back. By the way, all these things are I didn't want to dwell too much on 2018 versus now. Everything I talked about are things that are being reintroduced from the pre-2018 legal regime. But all of these things, all of these powers, other than ensuring control over the small number of already self-censoring civil society organizations, are going to give the agency immense powers, which it's going to turn to regular civil society organizations that are digging wells or building schools. And you're going to have, and this, by the way, this is not a hypothetical, this is actual real life examples from pre-2018. You'll have government agents going to civil society organizations and saying, oh, you might not meet auditing requirements. We're going to have to maybe shut you down, maybe not. We'll see. Basically signaling a call for corrupt practices. You go all the way from registration to post-registration. That is going to be completely back. So it's going to affect the civil society space in much deeper way, in a much deeper way, from the control over resources and rent perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Back to you.
Thank you so much, Abadir. I think that's a comprehensive, explanation. One on the why, right? Why is this happening and why is it happening now? Linking it to the desire to stay in power and the desire to retain control over institutions, over people, over everything, basically. And also the link to corruption, which is a very important one, which also needs thorough and further investigation, not only in Ethiopia, but in other parts of the world. Insofar as the content of the law itself as well, you've highlighted issues of a lack of certainty in what does this law even mean? How do I comply? How do I make sure that I don't violate the law? And also the extensive powers that the state wants to have over institutions or civil society organizations, and so that they're able to arbitrarily interfere, when they want to. But also the key issue of access to justice for those who are aggrieved, which is it's really serious that people cannot even say, I'm not happy with this outcome, and basically you have to stick with it. You don't have access to justice, and so it's very worrying. And unfortunately, as we'll hear in our next panel, this is not unique to Ethiopia. We've seen similar laws in other parts of the region. So I want to quickly go back to you, Meseret, just for 2 minutes. I know there's a lot of issues you've highlighted in the Ethiopian context. And I just want you in a minute and a little bit to say, what is your call to action? What does the world need to do? What does who need to do? What is your call to action to move the needle insofar as improving the human rights situation in Ethiopia? And then I'll ask you, Abadir, to also follow up very briefly on your call to action. The floor is yours, Meseret.
Thank you very much. I think thank you, Abadir, for going through it in depth. So as Abadir mentioned, the existence of the civil society in Ethiopia currently is almost to non-existence. So I call on upon the civil society organization in Ethiopia to come in solidarity. And this is the time for all the civil society organization and actors to come together and to resist this authoritarianism, and especially coming. I don't know what to expect from the 2026 election, but still they really have to come in solidarity and fight for their existence and fight for the democratic election. I call upon the international community and the diplomatic community in Ethiopia to pressure the government to uphold the rights of people's expression of opinions and the right of assembly. They have a say. Most of the organizations, especially the international organizations, they have a bilateral agreement with the governments, and they can use that around to pressure the government to open up the space again. Many of you, I hope, you saw the last year Civicus report, and that already was saying it was almost closed, and this year it's completely closed. So I call upon all the international community, all the human rights activists, human rights defenders, to resist this normalization of repression, to rebuild solidarity and to use all possible legal, digital, and diplomatic opportunity to defend the civic space. That's my call.
Excellent, Meseret, very loud and clear. Abadir, I'll ask you to respond to one of the questions that's come from the floor. Someone asks, as someone who was involved in the legal reform process that the current regime has purportedly initiated, was there a genuine intention to reform the civic space from the very beginning? Also, if the existing legislation itself didn't create an enabling environment, why our concern is focused on the proposed amendment? Shouldn't we challenge the broader context, including the existing legislation and practices? So please go ahead and answer that question, and also maybe quickly your call to action. You're muted if you're speaking. And I'd like you to please be brief because we still have a full other panel. So I encourage you to try and be brief as possible. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure if I fully caught the second part of it, but let me know if I don't cover the second part of the question, the second bit of the question. So was the legal reform in 2018 a genuine attempt? Was the first question. I think we will leave it to maybe historians to ponder that in the future, but my response to that is it doesn't really matter whether it was genuine or not. What matters was there was a genuine opening. Whether the government was genuine about it or not, I was of the predisposition that I didn't necessarily bank on it being genuine, but I did think it was a genuine attempt. But I also thought it was an attempt to reform because the government didn't really have a choice. The government's hands were forced. Don't forget that before the 2018 reform process, the government was going through reform, authoritarian type, revolutionary democracy type attempts to reform because it was sensing that it was losing its grip. But the 2018 reforms were ones in which you had an internal appellate coup within the party that promised to reform the country. And by the way, that's really a moment of transition to a transitional phase started in 2018, because one of the ways I define a transition to democracy, starting of the transition to democracy, is that when you have an authoritarian regime, genuine, not genuine, it doesn't matter, promises to democratize, and it is actually a believable promise, that's when you have the start of a transition. Now, Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government was promising to transition since 1991, 92. And maybe 91, 92, it was believable. Until 2018, it wasn't believable. In 2018, we all, Ethiopians, civil society organizations, international community, academics, everyone actually believed that there was a genuine transition. Was it genuine? Was it like intense? Don't matter in this point. And by the way, did the opposition that forced the hands of the government?
Recording
Thank
in
you so much,
progress.
Abadir. Very, very important to get to the bottom of the thing, not just scratch the surface. Thank you also for the questions. I see they're coming in thick and fast, and I really appreciate that. I want to quickly jump into panel 2 because I would like us to have enough time to ventilate some of the questions and really have more participation. I really appreciate the contributions from the speakers. It's been absolutely excellent. So we will now jump into panel number 2, which is looking at civic space, regional trends, and the upcoming elections. And in this space, we would really like to unpack some of the civic space issues in the region, having heard what we've heard about the context in Ethiopia, and then share some comparative insights from other countries, but also to really look at the question of authoritarian practices in the context of elections, what that means and what we need to do to respond to it, especially in light of the human rights impact of this. So the first speaker on this panel is Mudoki Momo. Mudoki will be speaking to the impacts that the media and journalists face, looking at countries like Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe. She will be highlighting some of the human rights impact on authoritarian practices on media in particular. Mudoki Momo is an African Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists, an independent press freedom organization. She leads the organization's research and advocacy in East and the Horn of Africa, Southern Africa, and Lusophone Africa. Ms. Momo has worked with CPJ since 2017 and previously served as the Africa Regional Representative and East Africa Correspondent. Her background is journalism, and between 2011 and 2017, she worked at the Nairobi headquarters of National Media Group, the largest media company in East and Central Africa, as a reporter for its daily, national, and business daily newspaper. Mumo has a bachelor's degree from the United States of International University in Nairobi and a master's degree jointly awarded by Aarhus University and the University of Hamburg. Mudoki, we've seen that the tactics of authoritarian regimes is really that whoever speaks up will be silenced. And this manifests in arbitrary arrests and forced disappearances and a host of human rights violations. Do share with us your experience, especially when it comes to media, and especially around the election context of the manifestation of these repressive tactics. Over to you. You have 10 minutes, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much. If I knew you would have to struggle through that very long and annoying biography, I would have said something different. Maybe Mudoki is a journalist or is a recovering journalist would have been adequate. Very happy to join everyone here, and thank you so much for all the attendees who've been with us for an hour and are still going strong. I believe this conversation is very important, particularly for this moment across the region, where in a lot of countries, things seem to be taking a turn for the worse. As Kanye pointed out, I will try to focus my submission from a media angle, recognizing that this is an entry point to a bigger conversation, that the media does not operate in isolation. This is just what I am a quote-unquote expert of. And I believe that having this understanding of what's happening with the media, but also casting it more broadly to the region is important because it helps us understand the problems we face in individual countries better, and it also helps us formulate solutions better. I divided my submission sort of into three main themes. And the first one is around the pattern of hope and dismay that we've seen a lot in this region. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about laws and what we've been seeing in those in changes to legislative frameworks across the region. And I wanted to conclude with a reflection on how the issues we're facing not only find parallels across borders, but are also transnational in nature, that they reach across borders. And I'm hoping, unfortunately, unlike Ibrahim, I don't have a very sophisticated analytical framework for what I'm going to be submitting, but I'm hoping that by telling some of these stories, they trigger our thought processes, they trigger our discussions about what the solutions are. So first theme, from hope to dismay. I want to share 3 very short stories about my own personal experiences at CPJ and before CPJ. We've been using 2018, and I want to connect them back to Ethiopia as much as I can as I draw regional parallels. We've been talking about 2018 as this inflection point in Ethiopia when there was sort of an opening, a hope for the future. And the first story I wanted to reflect upon was 2019, when I was in Addis Ababa in a room full of journalists from around the world and from across Africa. And this was such a hopeful moment because it was the first time that many people had been able to travel to Ethiopia for a long time. But it was also a moment where the Prime Minister said very proudly that there was no journalist behind bars. Hope, dismay. Last year, 5 years later, we at CPJ were talking about at least 50 Ethiopian journalists thrown into exile, fleeing because of safety concerns. And over a period of 5 years, we were also documenting many more journalists who'd spent some time behind bars, many of them being arrested more than once. A similar pattern of hope. This one's dismay to hope to dismay. In 2017, a Tanzanian journalist went missing. His name was Azori Gwanda. He wasn't very well known. He worked in a rural community in coastal Tanzania, and he was reporting stories about his community. Before he disappeared, he was mostly reporting mysterious disappearances of other people. A year later, myself and my colleagues and a colleague of mine traveled to Tanzania, And one of the things we were interested in was Azori Gwanda's story. We were arrested. Flash forward, and this was sort of a symptom of what people were suffering under the Magufuli government, the late President John Pombe Magufuli. But it was as just the tip of the iceberg because there was so much more going on. And flash forward past when she seems friendlier to the press, when people sort of relax and think maybe the government can be our friend. But even 2023, during a meeting in Arusha, hearing some President Samir telling the journalists, essentially, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. If you come for me, I will come for you. And really, that was a moment, even in the midst of hope, very clear sign that things have not changed. So from dismay to hope, again to dismay, because just this year, we have documented or we have seen a very drastic deterioration in Tanzania. I think Karamanchi, my colleague, will talk more about that, but I just wanted to sort of point this arch. Last story, Zambia. In 2021, a youth supported leader, Hakainde Hichilema, was elected as president. Again, there was a lot of hope for change. This year, almost, not exactly 5 years later, but you can see how the cycle is almost half a decade later. We're seeing that Zambia is passing some of the most restrictive laws we've seen in this region. Arches of hope to dismay, maybe back to hope again. I'm telling these stories because I think we, as members of the civil society, as media, and as activists, etc., need to ask ourselves how we adapt ourselves to these moments. Do we relax the pressure? Do we drink the Kool-Aid, to use an American phrase? And what disservice do we then do to our communities when we get to that moment of hope and we think, you know what, maybe I shouldn't push too much on this law. Maybe I'm making too much noise. Maybe we should be friendly in these environments. And there's room for diplomacy, of course. But what this tells us again and again and again is that we need to be more critical in our roles. I'm realizing 10 minutes is a very, very short time. So I'm going to skip on a lot that I wanted to say. But, before I jump to the laws, I think it's only fair that I reflect upon Kenya, my home country, because I'm talking about these other countries. And I think it's important to also reflect how maybe this arch has played out in a more elongated way in the country where I live, where I was raised. I was born and raised during the time of Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. I'm giving a lot of my biography now. I hope I don't look my age. And this was a time when it was a very closed environment, but I came of age during the opening up under the Kibaki era. And the first thing I ever did when I registered as a voter was vote for a new constitution. That was the first vote I ever cast as an adult in Kenya. And so you see Kenya going up, 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 this moment of a lot of euphoria. Things are great. We have a new constitution that protects freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. But I would argue that we've gone up, and once we got there, we realized that we have to fight and we have to continue fighting for these freedoms. And it has never been as clear as the moment we've been over the last 1 year, where I would say maybe we're going down again, where so many young people have been killed in protest, where journalism increasingly looks like a crime, where the government is accusing critics of false news left, right, and center. I'm going to skip the next thing that I want to talk about, the laws, because I think that was touched upon by many people, and just touch briefly upon this transnational reach that I teased at the top of this. Now, from what I've said so far, we can clearly see that the issues we're talking about here are not just Ethiopian, are not just Kenyan, Tanzanian, Ugandans, that they're issues that have parallels across borders wherever there are regimes or governments that have authoritarian tendencies. Now, we should also be increasingly cognizant of the transnational reach of repression. And this, for me, strikes home very closely as a Kenyan, because we live in a country that for a long time has sort of said it was the hub. We welcome people who are persecuted at home. But in 2022, we saw a Pakistani journalist killed in Kenya. Last year, we published a report interviewing Ethiopian journalists in exile, many of them who were in Kenya and Uganda, who talked about the fears they continue to have, the sometimes credible threats that they still face in exile. And just this year, we saw a Tanzanian journalist and activist abducted in Kenya, and in what is suspected to be an incident of transnational repression. And we might all be familiar with what happened to Kenyan and Ugandan activists when they tried to go to Tanzania to observe a trial. And all of this tells us that it is more important than ever that as we struggle, as we resist at home, to keep sort of an eye of what's happening across borders, because those threats might end up at our doorsteps. But we must also be called upon to stand in solidarity with those people who find themselves in our countries because home is no longer safe, because the civic space has completely closed at home. And I thought I would close by paraphrasing very roughly a comment that was made by a Ugandan journalist and colleague earlier this year, Agatha Atuhaire. Some of you might know her. She was among those who were arrested and tortured in Tanzania recently. And one of the things that she said in a press conference in Nairobi really struck home for me. And she said something to the effect of, when she was abducted and when the Kenyan colleague was abducted, they were saved by the ordinary people. They were not saved by people who had guns. They were not saved by people who had a big office or money or, anything. They were saved by ordinary people who stood up and said no and who made a lot of noise. And at the end of it, she said, this makes it clear to us East Africans, and I would argue this goes beyond East Africa, that we only have each other, but we are incredibly powerful even as ordinary people. And I think I want to close here and have that as sort of my very broad, very idealistic kumbaya call to action. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mudoki. That is such a powerful picture that you've painted, a vivid picture of swinging on a pendulum of being hopeful one moment and then despair, and swinging back to despair and hopefulness, and just really highlighting how fragile freedom is. That we always have to work at it. We always have to push. We always have to be holding to account leaders for the promises they make, because when they start, they make the promises. We will give you, you will enjoy human rights, and they say all this rhetoric, but when it comes to it, promises are broken, our freedoms are taken away, all for the sake of holding on to power. Thanks also for keeping time. I really encourage other speakers to do the same. I see also that some panelists are responding in the chat to some of the questions, and I encourage other panelists to also do so. Audience, I also encourage you to keep popping in those questions, and I hope that we'll have a bit of time for some of the respondents to responses to be done orally. So we will now move on to John Ador, who will look at the South Sudan experience. And John will speak to some of the softer issues around culture, cultural factors, and very important issues around the gendered impacts of shrinkage of civic space, and really draw some comparative examples which we can learn from in the Ethiopian context. John is a human rights advocate and strategist, currently working as the Program Development Officer after previously holding the position of Protection and Advocacy Officer at South Sudan Human Rights Defenders Network. With extensive experience in policy engagement, John has partnered with national, regional, and international stakeholders on initiatives focused on influencing legal frameworks and policies aimed at improving the situation of human rights defenders in South Sudan. John brings deep expertise in governance, legal frameworks, and psychosocial support for human rights defenders, alongside a strong track record in donor-aligned reporting and advocacy. His work is driven by commitment to justice, accountability, and sustainable change, particularly in advancing gender equality and safeguarding civic freedoms in South Sudan. The floor is yours, John, and you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. I hope you can clearly hear me. All right. I want to apologize for the background noise. I think there's a plane that is passing nearby. I'll try my best to package my conversation within 10 minutes, but I'll try to also finish before 10 minutes. Well, as I was listening in to the conversation from my panelists that have spoken before,
John, do we still have you? I think John might have some technical challenges. I wonder if we should jump to the next speaker while John fixes his technology. And do let us know if switching camera off might be helpful. So, John, while you try to reconnect, I'm going to invite our next speaker. John, are you back? Okay, I'm going to invite our next speaker, Andrew Karamagi, who's from Uganda, who will share comparative experiences in Kenya. Andrew is a lawyer, budding scholar, and community organizer. His areas of interest and his name. Karamagi has co-authored in the international journal Agenda, and among other publications has contributed chapters to book projects on civil society in Uganda. He contributes opinions for media houses in East Africa and often delivers guest lectures in the humanitarian department of Makerere, Strathmore, and Johannesburg universities. Andrew, the floor is yours. We look forward to hearing about comparative experiences in Tanzania, especially with the elections upcoming. You have 10 minutes, John. Andrew.
Thank you very much. Please confirm that you can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Great. So if I were to attempt a frame of analysis, it would be in a statement that says, there is no humane way to rule people against their will. There is no humane way to rule people against their will. That's the foundation that will inform my brief submission. And having said that, there are a few points to put across in terms of the comparative analysis between the two countries. There are common threads that run through the experience of those countries that can be traced to each of those countries. But to start with is to note that in both Uganda and Tanzania, you have long-standing regimes, whether it is in the form of post-colonial liberation movements that became pre-colonial and post-colonial liberation movements that became political parties, or individual rulers who have held power than most of the population there has been alive. To be specific, the Chama cha Mapinduzi in Tanzania, CCM, has been in power since the independence of that country. They are better than us in Uganda in the sense that they've changed leaders, but the establishment, CCM, has been in place since independence to this day. As with other countries elsewhere, where you have these liberation movements becoming political parties, they often find themselves in a situation where fatigue about them necessitates them to deploy violence, some of it through the law, since the state is an instrument of class rule. They deploy the law or laws to maintain their grip onto power. In the Ugandan example, you have one person who has ruled longer than the previous 8 presidents combined. General Yoweri Museveni has been in power for close to 40 years, longer than even people like myself who were not born completely when we begin serving citizens. So I often contend against, and those from the NGO community might have encountered something called the human rights-based approach, which assumes 2 things. It assumes that you have citizens, we refer to them in NGO language as rights holders, and on the other hand, you have duty bearers, who is the government or the leaders. It is my submission that we have neither citizens nor governments in these countries. What you have are coalitions between illicit business interests, ethnic alliances, and the means of violence, which hijack a state and then use it to achieve their narrow interests or designs. And finally, before I share what the comparative because of what's happening in the Gaza Strip, this final point is about Western complicity in enactment of these laws. So following the terrorist attacks in the US in September 11, 2001, there has been a regressive legislative agenda in many of these countries that we were discussing in this today, in this space. And Uganda and Tanzania are not exceptions. So when the Pentagon or the US Congress or intelligence agencies in Europe say, we want you to pass a law on money laundering, or we want you to pass a law that enables you to monitor security in your countries, homeland security and so on, and they actually fund regimes that they know are repressive to pass such laws, inevitably, our tyrants back home take advantage of the enactment of laws on money laundering, which perhaps are motivated by good intention to track terrorist financing and whatnot, but then they rely on these laws to suppress the rights of their citizens. So I am also indicting in this point the Western or so-called international community, which knowingly enables the enactment of these laws that then become a problem to the rest of us in these countries. So this repression manifests in a number of ways. And you can point to the legal that, yes, we are talking about. There is the case of financial strangulation, where, as we've seen with the Ethiopian law that we're discussing, that has implications for how much the NGO or civil society fraternity can access or mobilize funding for the work that they do. You have the outright use of violence. You have smear campaigns that are directed at these entities and that refer to them as agents of imperialism. Then you also have the political aspects of it, the administrative, but put together, you then arrive at the situation that you find yourselves in. And in closing, I'll just highlight laws like the Media Services Act in Tanzania, laws on national security and public order in the same country. And we have almost word for word in Uganda, the Computer Misuse Act, which perhaps selfishly I can blow my own trumpet and say, I successfully challenged this in the Constitutional Court. But that notwithstanding, people are still being arrested and charged under a law that has been thrown out by the courts. So it again takes us back to where I began from, to say there is no humane way to rule people against their will. These laws that we're discussing are mere maidens or midwives that deliver the repression that we suffer from in this context. Last sentence, Tanzania has been largely a quiet country that if you have no intimate knowledge of, it appears to be one of those peaceful countries that you never see on the news, no controversy or anything, until the situation that my colleague Muthoki mentioned blew open the lid and exposed this. Why? Because, sorry to put it so bluntly, but repression in Tanzania has largely happened in Swahili, which is not a language that is spoken widely in many parts of the continent or region. But now that the discussion is becoming, is getting more into languages that people can understand, especially English, we now get to see what has been happening there, and people are surprised about what a mess that place is, just like the neighboring hybrid regime in Kampala. That's my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew, especially also for utilizing that time so effectively. You've shared so much about, some interesting ideas around, for example, following the money, who's sponsoring the enactment of some of these laws in our countries, and of course their manifestation of the repression through smear campaigns, violence, repressive laws. Also very interesting how, some of the resistance strategies face such, you go all the way to litigation, which is expensive, time consuming, only for the government to not implement the outcome of that judgment. So really difficult context, but what stands out for me is your quote that there is no humane way to rule people against their will. I think that is very important, especially for authoritarians to know. I will now move back to you, please, John. I hope you are now can speak. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, it's still raining here in Juba. I hope the network will not fail us this time around. Thank you very much. Well, as I mentioned earlier on, I said that what we really face as Africans seems to be similar demons, and we have some sort of same repressive government that tend to try and ensure that they exert much power and authority over the majority of the citizens. Well, South Sudan situation is not that very much different in terms of the government trying to put in place laws and practices and cultures and policies that tend to have more authority over what the people should say or what the people should eat and when they should be able to do something. By the way, as a fact, South Sudan, I think, is the only country that requires you to seek permission in written form from the security to hold a meeting just in your office space. And not just seeking permission, but also having some security personnel sent to be amongst you and be able to listen in to the conversation that you're having. And that is a culture. It is not that it is written in the laws of our country that, we are supposed to seek clearance from the security and be able to have conversation where the security personnel listen to. But you find yourself in every sitting, every arrangement, national security officials sit in those discussions. If you look at the setup of South Sudan, you realize that the majority of the population are the youth, where we have over 90% of the population of the youth. And if you look at the civil society setup, you notice that civil society is majorly made up of youth. I'm sure this is the same situation in most of African countries, where that age group, there is that age group that is associated to the civil society. And in most cases, with the cultural beliefs of South Sudan, it is believed that civil society's work is a work of noisemakers. It's a work of people that really do not have other sources of survival other than being used by Western cultures to try and, dehumanize the society that has already been, traditionally set up in a manner that, there is that ultimate respect to your elders. And, you do not really have to question what your elders do. But nevertheless, our government still sees it as a threat to see that the youth are more vocal and are more active in trying to fight back for some of the social justices that are happening. And this is the reason as why, in most cases, you'll find South Sudan borrows some of our regional partners, some of our countries that are neighboring us, their laws, and be able to, come and also contextualize them to our situation and be able to adapt them. As we speak right now, I think if we already have the NSS bill that is very contentious. It has already been passed, where if you, by any chance, you are suspected, just by the mere being suspected of, trying to antagonize the country, this is when the security has the mandate to come and arrest you, even without the warrant. They do not really have to acquire the warrant to arrest you. So you tend to find that they make it become a practice. They culturalize it in their system that if any national security officer suspects you, regardless of what you're doing, they come in. So the junior officers tend to use that culture that has already been implanted in the system and act by their own accord. Come and arrest you, disrupt your events, and be able to really do whatever they want to do with it. We've also seen that we've seen the situation whereby bills and laws that are primarily enhancing and empowering this the majority in the power, the elites in power, who are more of the old age, trying to consolidate the authority over that youth group to try and ensure that they do not have so much voices. Now we have the cyber security bill that has been adapted from, I think, Uganda passed it recently, and then Kenya, I think, also adapted it, and we're now having it in the parliament to being discussed. But you'll
John, thank you so much. I think we've lost you again. I'm so sorry that you're experiencing bad weather that's impacting your connection. But you've made really important points around some of the, excessive control that government puts in place through law and then through culture on people's ability to express themselves, to associate, to assemble, and also just really highlighting the role of the youth, which I think we've seen in some of the countries in the region, that youth are active in resisting some of these attacks. I'm really happy to see that there are more questions and comments coming in the chat, and I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to respond to some of them. I welcome any questions and thoughts or comments you may have for panel 2, as they have now completed their session. I want to now hand over to Estelle to share some reflections on strategies for resistance having heard what we've heard in this space, really to help stimulate some thinking on how can we push back against some of these practices. And then after that, I hope we'll have time just to answer some of the questions, share some reflections before we draw to a close. So Estelle Kansime is the Advocacy Research and Communications Manager at Defend Defenders. She oversees and coordinates the organization's advocacy, research, and communications related initiatives for both internal and external audiences. She is a human rights lawyer with over 10 years' experience in strategic advocacy, research, and communications at national, regional, and international level. She is highly experienced with engaging with the regional and international human rights mechanisms, including the African Commission, as well as the United Nations Human Rights Council. Additionally, she is a skilled researcher and has authored and co-authored human rights-related publications for both professional and personal issue or use. Estella is a skilled trainer of human rights principles, strategic advocacy, and communications. Estella holds a Master's of Laws in Human Rights and Democratization in Africa from the University of Pretoria, as well as a Bachelor's of
Recording in
To
progress.
strengthen existing networks for collective action. Another strategy would be strengthening existing protection initiatives or protection service providers. We have a number of these on the continent, including defenders. These provide emergency support, relocation, legal aid, psychosocial support, documentation of threats and attacks. Is critical also for building cases that demand for international attention. So it's important to strengthen the existing initiatives so that human rights defenders that are at risk as a result of the closing spaces have a go-to point to receive support and protection. Andrew touched on the use of legal strategies, strategic litigation, through the various existing human rights mechanisms and platforms. We see a recent example, for instance, is Boniface Mwangi and Agatha Tuhaire are pursuing justice through the Tanzanian courts, through the East African Court of Justice for the violations that they faced in their recent attacks. There's also need to engage in advocacy at existing multilateral human rights fora. Tied to that, one example is the African Commission of the Human and People's Rights and the United Nations Human Rights Council. These spaces bring together various stakeholders that are seeking, among others, justice and accountability. They have, for instance, set up strong investigative mechanisms to monitor, document, and report on human rights violations and abuses. We see that, for instance, we see the Commission of Human Rights in South Sudan, we see the fact-finding mission on Sudan, we see the International Committee of Experts that was previously set up on Ethiopia. So engaging in these human rights fora also is a strategy that can be applied in light of the shrinking civic space on our continent. Quickly, I'd also like to emphasize the need to enhance capacity of local activists. This ranges from both the digital, physical security awareness to all activists. How prepared are you to counter digital and physical threats? How safe is your data? How safe are your gadgets? What are your advocacy skills? What are your resilience strategies? So a well-rounded capacity enhancement of activists would also go a long way in terms of reclaiming back the space that we see is quickly shrinking or in some instances has been closed. Tied to that, we see the need to develop digital countermeasures as one of the strategies. Disinformation and online harassment are also part of the repression playbook, but we've seen activists counter some of these repressions with fact, storytelling, and humor. In Kenya, citizens use social media to expose pro-government disinformation accounts and urge the public to block and report them. In Tanzania, platforms like Jamii Forum help educate citizens about civic rights and political accountability. Another strategy that I could also highlight could be tied to non-cooperation tactics such as boycotts, defunding, work stoppages, platform disruption, open letters, and whistleblowing are not luxuries. They're also essential tools for transforming anger into accountability. In Kenya, we see activists launched a boycott of Safaricom over allegations of enabling state surveillance that led to the abduction of human rights defenders and protesters. We've also seen globally similar attempts, for instance, when Apple products were being boycotted because of the violations related to cobalt extraction in the DRC. Social media has also emerged as a key tool for resistance. Digital platforms are now central to organizing and mobilizing and exposing abuses. Platforms like X, Telegram are being widely used by activists to also put pressure on the different violations on civic space attacks. We saw how this pressure was applied when Agatha and Boniface were abducted. We saw, for instance, also in Uganda when online protests were organized quite successfully against corruption and against misuse of public resources. But also we shouldn't forget that traditional media. It's important to build partnerships with outlets such as international media that cover some of these issues that we continuously highlight, the BBC, Al Jazeera, African arguments that help to spotlight civic space violation and also generate external pressure. The BBC documentary Blood Parliament is one such example that exposed the death that occurred during the 25th June 2024 protests in Kenya. I'm coming to an end, Kamil. Don't worry, I have about 2 more points to raise. I would also like to emphasize the strategy on prioritizing well-being and psychosocial support. We see that fear, burnout, anxiety, and imposter syndrome are also deliberate tools of repression, and also because of the work that is done by human rights activists and defenders, they are prone to fear and burnout. So we cannot ignore the need to pay attention to well-being and psychosocial support as survival strategies. Practices such as building rest into activism, sharing emotional load, making space for joy, trauma-informed policies, creating safe spaces for defenders, funding models that center well-being are also very key to reclaim and to strengthen resistance as we tackle the shrinking civic space across the continent. I think then finally, my other recommendation or reflection would be to also think about the other countries on the continent that have closed entirely civic spaces, countries like Eritrea, Rwanda, Burundi, where it's completely closed and where we have independent media almost non-existent. We have human rights defenders have fled into exile. These countries shouldn't be forgotten, and where opportunities arise, those that exist in freer spaces should speak out more fully and should also highlight and draw attention to what is happening in situations where space is completely closed. Their contributions are critical to drawing international support and protection for such countries. So thank you very much, Kanyo. I hope I haven't taken too much time, but I would like to end here. Of course, these strategies are not exhaustive. It's important to continuously reflect, to be innovative, and to be cognizant of the times that we live in, to be able also to enhance the strategies, to be able to counter the shrinking space. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Estelle. I think you've given us a wealth of ideas and strategies to look at for our various jurisdictions, but also regionally. So as we draw to a close, I see there are many questions in the chat. I'd like to invite Abadir and Meseret to attempt to respond to one or two of them. But before that, I want to invite you, Andrew, to just reflect on very briefly, what can other countries do in the region? What does the AU need to do? What does the African Commission need to do? Because sometimes Ethiopia is perceived, there's a temptation to look at Ethiopia as an island, far away, and that what is happening there doesn't affect anyone else. So what should other actors in the region do, and what should regional mechanisms do, and what is your call to action? After that, then I'll hand it to Abadir, then Meseret to try to respond to some of the questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I do not have much faith in the institutions that you've talked about, whether as national governments or as regional or international bodies, because the evidence consistently shows that these entities are paper-pushing organizations that only come to conduct post-mortems, but are not active when the person can still be saved. I'm speaking figuratively. Beyond issuing statements of condemnation and then setting up committees, and then issuing a glossy 200, 300-page report about what happened, there is little that they can do, it seems to me. And I'll give you a specific example from East Africa, the East African Court of Justice, but which can be used to explain the institutions you've mentioned. The East African Court of Justice was introduced as part of the East African community to be a court that, amongst other things, resolves trade disputes, addresses human rights violations, but also ensures that member countries of the East African community are adhering to the standards, the democratic and other standards that have been placed in that treaty. The East African Court of Justice has no funding, has limited to no funding. The East African Court of Justice is understaffed, and this happens almost every time there is a slew of cases filed there for interpretation. That's the challenge that you have. So, in conclusion, having made that point about my lack of faith in this institution that you've mentioned, the bulk of my hope and effort would go to the people. From Kansime's submission, we've seen how effective people power has been in Sudan, in Kenya, and so concentrate, we, the people, to push back, and without offending you, our South African colleagues here, we can see what protest has done in terms of holding public officials or institutions accountable when it comes to the observation and preservation of civil rights and liberties. So it's the people for me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. I think that's a powerful note, that the power rests within us as the people, and that's where we should invest and continue to push. So I'm going to invite you, Meseret, followed by Abadir. Your call to action, your response to some of the questions, or a question or a summary, trying to respond to some of the key issues raised in the questions that folks have put in the chat. The floor is yours, Meseret. Please go ahead, and then Abadir, you'll close us off.
Thank you very much. I actually tried to respond on the chat as well, but like I can also respond here for some of the questions that has been raised by a couple of participants. For me, like the promised reform served as several purposes at the time. They helped rebuild international legitimacy, like attracted donor support, or like it also attracted the Nobel Peace Prize and gave the impression of a democratic transition after years of protest under, after unrest, after arrest. But these reforms were not like rooted in a genuine commitment of a long-term democratic governance. They were like largely instrumentalized, designed to stabilize the regime, rather than open the system. Like it was so cosmetic. If all you remember, like the cabinet was also like 50% women. All the legal reforms are very much like instrumental and very cosmetics. Also, the government doesn't appear to fear or like losing the election. Like I'm talking about the coming election. So in the traditional sense, the political opposition has been fragmented. I don't think like there is like a strong political opposition existed currently. So the criminalized or co-opted by the government, or their registration is licensed by the National Electoral Board. So what the government fears is more than the ballot box, is organizing the civic resistance, whether from journalists or from activists or human rights defender. So like that's why the repression is now more targeted at the civil society, media, and grassroots movement rather than political competition. So while election may not pose an immediate threat, public accountability does. And in authoritarian system, even small acts of dissent can speak broader mobilization. So the strategy is to close the space completely, criminalized or crucified the actors in the space. Yes, some of the things definitely sound deja vu. The new CSO amendment mirrors the 2009 law that crashed the civic space and helped spark the protests that led to the regime change. The space was never actually truly safe, even like after the post-2018. Fear of degradation, surveillance, and retaliation kept many of the civil society and the actors to self-censorship mode. So no, civil society didn't misuse the space. They were just never truly free of being free to begin with. So, and now even that limited space is being completely closed. Yeah, that's my answer for the couple of questions raised on the chat box. Over to you, Abadir.
Thank you. Give me 1 second. Okay, there I am. Oh, wait, one more step. Okay, there I am. I tried to go through as many questions as I could. It didn't go through many, but I'll try to catch as many as I can, as fast as I can. I will go back to the question of whether the reforms were genuine or not, whether the transition is genuine or not, because it was raised a couple of times as well. And say that I think, it's looking at it from a point of view of whether it's genuine or not is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also important to be able to look beyond that question, because it's going to be relevant in the future as well. So when we go back and look at 2018 and the transition, or if this question comes up in the future, the government didn't reform because it was good or bad or genuine or not genuine. The government reformed because it was forced to. It did not have a choice. That is the moment of 2018 becomes possible because civic action, civil society action, the Qero movement especially is important, but the other the movements as well. There's the Fano movement, there's the Muslim protest movement, and very importantly, by the way, labor union movement was starting to not flourish but mushroom in Ethiopia at that moment, and so the Ethiopia was put to a place of non-governability by these protest movements. And the government did not have a choice but to concede, to agree to transition. And this analysis applies after 2018 all the way through now as well. After 2018, the question should be or should have been whether the government is still being forced to democratize or not. And this was a tremendous mistake on the part of a lot of people. I was part of lots of movements in the diaspora as well. I'll come to the diaspora question that was raised, where the calculation changed into, oh, there's this good guy who took over and he is going to save us. I saw a number of pro-peace movements, a number of solidarity movements, non-political, by the way, I'm not talking about the political actors, non-political solidarity movements completely dissolve with the analysis of genuine, not genuine, good guy, bad guy. That was never the issue. The issue was they didn't have a choice. And when they had a choice, and they thought they could get away with not proceeding with the reforms, they basically, even if we assume there's like good guys and bad guys, everyone who asked the question of whether it was genuine or not, I want you to ask yourself, if you're in power, what would you have done? And my response to you is that you would have ended up going in very similar lines, because remember, I don't remember who the quote is from, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's not about intentions, it's about the structures, and it's about what's possible. And so I think that's important, because we made lots of mistakes because we were focusing on Nobel Peace Prizes and things like that, and forgetting the basics, the 101, the ABCs of organizing and forcing a government. And by the way, I want to say that the government is to blame. And when we ask the question of what happened, what should happen in the future, we should also always ask ourselves what our role was. And that's important, because pointing fingers prevents you from pointing to yourself and what you could have done, and what you could do in the future is affected by if you're thinking about good guys and bad guys. Izana asked about why does one human rights organization gets targeted and the other doesn't. I think as a rule of thumb, I think you should, a good way to look at it is it's a question of effectiveness. If you're effective, if you're threatening the government's hold on power, then you will be targeted. If not, maybe not. There's
Okay, thank you, Kanyo. But I think I also did respond to the question. I did type a response, but the question was on where to obtain psychosocial support. And I did mention that the different protection service providers existing do offer various kinds of support. I give an example of different defenders. We do offer psychosocial support, but of course this is dependent on the need of the human rights defender at risk. So I'd advise the person that asked the question to seek out the different protection service providers that are existing on the continent and the supports that they do provide. That often an element of protection support includes psychosocial support and well-being support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Estelle. Mudoki, if you can close us off with this last question. The person says it's wonderful to be optimistic and believe in ourselves. Powerful, we say, but how do we achieve a safe and envisaged civic space without the payment through warm bodies and displacement of human rights defenders? I intentionally leave out the permanent slots always reserved for us in prisons.
I think the straightforward answer, the very honest answer is, I don't know. But the longer answer is, we don't call these things resistance and struggles and fights because they are easy. All of those words suggest that there's a cost. When you approach, when you confront an entity that is determined to stay in power and to hold on to power and resources, there's always a cost. And I think, but the question is, how do we mitigate the risks that we face? And I think that's a better question to answer, because if you're confronting someone who has the monopoly of a violence, well, maybe not the monopoly of a violence, but if you're approaching someone who's really willing to deploy violence against you with impunity, it's unrealistic to say that you're going to eliminate all risk. The question is, how will you mitigate that risk? How will you adopt behaviors, practices, and strategies that keep you safe as possible, that put more and more obstacles between you and the source of the risk? And, you know, a lot of this is going to sound like cliche, but solidarity, being together, standing together goes a really, really long way. I remember last year in June in Kenya, before the protest went really, really bad, and even after the protest really went really bad, I remember being on the streets and thinking, feeling safer than I have never felt. I've never felt so safe in that big a crowd as I did when I was among protesters in Kenya in June 2024. Of course, things have changed. There have been attempts to infiltrate those protests. But the point was, we were there in numbers. There were many of us, and each one of us was looking out for the other. That's a strategy for mitigation. And solidarity, it can sound like a cliche, but it really does make a lot of difference, whether you're standing by yourself or whether you're standing with others. And those others who stand with you don't have to be the person next to you. I go back to the quote that I made when our Ugandan colleague, journalist Agatha in Kenya, said that she was saved by ordinary people. Those ordinary people made themselves hard to their own governments, online and offline. Because, and I think it's Andrew Karamaji who pointed out that the people are now the strongest sort of front for resistance that we have. And having people stand together and speak loudly is, just one of the best ways to put more and more obstacles between you and risk. Having said that, I will emphasize what Estelle has said. There are entities out there that are trying to provide support to people at risk because of their human rights defense work. I think maybe, Estelle, we should share the Journalist in Distress Network link as a starting point. But the reality is that those entities do not always have the capacity to provide the kind of comprehensive, holistic support that we would love to. We will all admit this, but they are there and ready and willing to step in at a moment of crisis. The last thing I'll say is the cost, raising the cost of repression really matters also to our own safety. And what does this mean? One of the speakers, I think it was Messeret, pointed out it's part of the strategies. We must think about who are the actors that are collaborating and working with our own governments. And I see a really good example of this work when it comes to the research that is ongoing globally around surveillance technology. You had a lot of human rights defenders, journalists, and activists facing the risk that is posed by things like spyware, like Pegasus, but not knowing how to even begin to confront such a huge, monstrous in the privacy. But when you start identifying, following the money, who's the person who's doing this? Where do they exist? Who regulates them? And finding those uncommon ways to get back at the risk you face at home, identifying pressure points and levers that are beyond the traditional is another way you can begin to ensure that risk is mitigated and minimized for your communities. But at the end of the day, anyone telling you there'll be no cost for resistance is lying to you. The question is, how do you mitigate it?
Thank you very much. So this is the very last question that I'd like Messeret to please answer before I hand over to my colleague to close the meeting for us. Messeret, somebody's very concerned here about the role of NGOs. I noted Abadir's concern about diaspora. Is there concern about the role of international NGOs? Should they issue press statements calling out the Ethiopian government? Is that helpful at all?
I don't think issuing a statement will help anything, but like I said earlier, they have a bilateral agreement with the government, especially the international NGOs, so they can use that to create a space for the civic space, to create a space and an opportunity for civil society actors to sit down and discuss this civil society bill and to pressure the government. But the statement, it has been done and it's going to continue like that. But in my opinion, I haven't seen a change or a difference by stating a statement, but they have a power against the government and they can use that. I strongly suggest their bilateral agreement and their other relationship with the government rather than issuing the statement.
Thanks so much, Messeret. Abadir, I don't know if you want to add to that. Any views on issuance of statements, roles of international NGOs?
Let me quickly say that, yes, it is. It should be. I mean, if you give me the choice between them not doing anything and issuing a statement, I'd say it's good to issue a statement. But this goes down the line of the symptoms versus, illness question that I talked about. It's addressing a symptom. Fine, it's not going to make much. I agree with Messeret. It's not going to make much of a big difference in terms of, yes, you will treat. It probably won't succeed, but even if it does, it treats a symptom. It's going to come up tomorrow. So I think, I wouldn't discourage issuing a statement, but I would also not bank too much on that. But I will also say that international actors, broadly speaking, should also be asking themselves if they're actually supporting authoritarianism. That's an important question to ask, because don't forget the elections. Don't forget even before and after the elections, the role of international actors was not always a positive one. So they should be asking them, and pre-2018 too, by the way. I was actually very active in advocacy focused towards international actors before 2018, where they were supporting authoritarianism, some of it in the name of fighting terrorism, but some of it in the name of supporting democracy. Obama went to Addis and said Ethiopia was a democracy. I mean, imagine how much support in terms of legitimation that gives Ethiopia when protesters were working against to democratize the country. And so I think even today, I'm not up to date on exactly who is supporting what. I think there's a question for international actors to ask themselves what they're doing, how they're maybe supporting authoritarianism. This specifically goes to the international funding institutions, which sound like they're banking on supporting an authoritarian regime, hoping that it would not collapse. That is, one factor, but also hoping it would come out as some sort of, neoliberal mecca. I think there should be. It's not just this question. It's the symptom question, illness question, but also a question of whether they are actually part of the illness as well. It's a question that should retrospectively ask themselves.
Excellent. Thank you, Abadir, and Meseret, and all the speakers. I think we've certainly achieved our objective today. We sought to look at the implications of the CSO law in Ethiopia, and then look at some of the impact of repressive laws in our region, especially in the context of upcoming elections, but also then share some comparative experiences and strategies for resistance. So this has been an excellent space. I really appreciate the expertise shared by our speakers today, but more importantly, I appreciate your participation, your questions. Please, let's continue to stand together. I think a theme that's run through this entire conversation is that we are not powerless. We have the power, and the key message is resistance. In all the corners of the world that we sit, and where these authoritarian leaders suppress dissent, suppress our enjoyment of right, let us resist and let us use our power. So with that, I'd like to please hand over to my colleague Suad, just to close us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanyo. I hope you can hear me. Awesome.
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, colleagues, for your insight and your input in this important conversation. What stood out for me beyond everything that has been said, which has been really, outstanding and just so much information to take in and digest, is the powerful role of civil society and the power that it holds and it plays across in the region, including Ethiopia, considering what it's going through. But when it comes to coming together, it's important that we resist, as Kanyo has said. That's what we should take home from this, if nothing else, is resistance. And that also what Mutoki mentioned with regards to the cycle of hope and dismay, then renewed hope. That the government might stand with people only for reality to show otherwise. So many of the challenges that have been discussed and we see here are very similar across the region, but we must not forget that the countries where civic space is also completely shut, such as in Eritrea. And in the face of this, it's clear that we, the people, must push back regardless of the circumstances we're going through, and that the real power really lies with us. But yes, I would also just like to thank Mr. Abadir Ibrahim for his time and his team's valuable support in shaping this conversation and all the background work his team has done with us, and their partnership, as well as his deep insight of the Ethiopia context. A big thank you to Mutoki and her team, her comms team, with their technical support, as well as sharing, real stories that has shown us, the real reality on the ground with regards to civic space and how it's truly shrinking in the region, but the ups and downs as well. So thank you so much, Muthoki and Ms. Meseret Ali, for her powerful contributions from the Ethiopian context and responding to all the questions that have come through in the chat box. And to Ms. Kansime on her insight and expertise and, resistance and looking forward. Also like to thank Mr. Andrew for representing the Ugandan and Tanzanian context with clarity and conviction, most importantly. And John Ador for shedding light on the realities in South Sudan, regardless of his internet connections. We truly appreciate the effort, and also would like to thank, the Amnesty staff and team that has been working behind the scenes for convening this important panel, helping steer the conversation forward, ensuring that the civic space actors feel our solidarity, consistent solidarity, and encouraging them to continue their work. And of course, a very big thank you to Ms. Kanyo for hosting the panel in a smooth and timely manner. We truly appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. And on that note, thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Suad, and thanks, colleagues. Have a great day, and we will continue this conversation.
Thank you, Kaino.
Recording stopped.